My name is Hendrik Poinar. I'm an evolutionary geneticist.
I'm Simon Critchley. I teach philosophy at the New School for Social Research.
My name is Martin Blazer. I'm a medical doctor.
I'm Max Brooks. I'm the author of the novel World War Z.
I'm Maike Dittmann. I'm assistant professor at NYU Langone.
My name is Gil Eyal. I am a professor of sociology at Columbia University.
So I think any time you have an epidemic, it takes people by surprise. But many people have been concerned about the fact that a pandemic strain would arise.
Most of the emergences in the past and continue today are what we call zoonotic emergences, so emergences from animals into humans. You know, between 60 and 70% of infectious diseases all come from animal reservoirs.
So typically, from what we know, that virus is able to infect like up in the nasal cavity and the bronchi. And then once these cells die, because the immune system kicks in, it creates this like avalanche of things that maybe drip back and drip all the way into the lung. And when it's there, the immune system basically really knows it needs to work and then potentially overshoots. So from what we know, what we understand, the havoc actually does not come from the virus itself. It's more that this first line of defense goes ballistic and shoots with everything it has and then kind of overshoots. And that will cause like more inflammation. And so when it does, you're generally in trouble.
I mean, we see this within, a matter of 24 hours, you can have dissemination of a virus across the globe.
Yeah, because we have a big world population and we're so interconnected. We're only 2 days away by air travel from virtually anywhere in the world. If something bad arises in one place, it can spread rapidly.
And that's nothing like what occurred back in 400, 600 years ago.
Well, unfortunately, history is full of epidemics. There have been plagues from the beginning of recorded history involving dysentery and cholera and the bubonic plague. The list goes on and on.
Yeah, we know that Black Death caused by this bacterium killed, the estimates are somewhere on the order of 30% of the European population at the time.
But plague was the price for living in a city, living in a town, living together with other human beings. And so we're waking up to something very old with this presence of coronavirus.
Right, so we're talking about mortality rates now in the 3%. If you think about the Black Death being a representative of 30% or 40%, that's something, that it's almost impossible to conceptualize what that actually meant.
And the bigger the plague, the more unsettling it is to the status quo. And so people's habits change, their social mores change. When you sneeze, now we say, God bless you. That comes back from where people thought if you sneezed, that was the first sign that you had the plague. And so you needed God's blessing.
People had no idea where the contagions were coming from, right? Remember that only, 100 years ago, so we had Pasteur and Koch explaining to us that they're actually microorganisms causing disease. Before that, it was this sense of miasma and this contagion, this sort of weirdness in the air. And so no one had any idea where things were coming from. Even 100 years ago, it's changed, right? I mean, the 1918 flu epidemic, considered the most recent major pandemic that we all sort of reference to, it moved exceptionally quickly. And that really had a lot to do with the fact that troops were returning home or movement from the war. And so that exacerbated the effects of the flu pandemic.
We haven't dealt with that kind of pandemic recently, so it's really hard to predict. And I know everybody wants to know, I want to know, but it's really, we don't know.
Diseases or epidemics today are really anchored in our responses and the expressions of those in the past. So in the beginning, there's recognition that something is wrong. There's finally an admittance by people that might be in charge. And then during the epidemic growth curve, there's this hunt or search for an explanation that usually leads to blame, where we start blaming other populations. Governments are really called into whether they respond correctly or whether they respond poorly. There's a lot of unknowns, but at the same time, I think there's a lot of expectations that the medical community will provide all these answers.
But as a social scientist, I think that's actually not often the right question to ask. There's been several decades of declining levels of trust in experts. Mistrust is very simple to explain. I think it's actually a very rational response to mistrust. And there is something irrational about trusting. People say, okay, mistrust of science, but we're not talking about the science that scientists conduct in the laboratory in which they're trying to figure out things. We are talking about the uses of science for social, political, and other kinds of purposes. Those are decisions that allocate winners and losers. I mean, in the current situation, you can think about it as who gets the test, right? I have a friend who's an infectious disease expert. Right now, her job is to take calls from emergency room doctors who say, I have this patient, can they get the test or not? Because, of course, there aren't enough tests. They discuss, okay, how many do we have? How do we adapt the rules? Can we relax the protocol? So the basis on which those decisions are made can change quite a bit. So it can appear to somebody who goes to the hospital and, gets the response, no, you cannot get the test. And then later they hear, Kevin Durant got the test, whoever else. It can appear as arbitrary. It can appear as bureaucracy. But on the other hand, there's no way for us to run a democratic, liberal society without trusting experts because the alternatives are far worse.
In my book, in World War Z, the virus starts in China, and the Chinese suppress the truth. And then it's too late. Because in order to have an effective virus get out of control, you can't just have a large population, you can't just have a state-of-the-art transportation network. You also need a government that is willing to suppress information.
In China, government officials tried to cover up this epidemic when it was happening in Wuhan. It interfered with their concept of what's going to happen with production and with the Chinese New Year. And as a result, they lost about a month when the epidemic was rising silently. And so then it just exploded in Wuhan.
China has all the elements for a pandemic. Even though with this new coronavirus, they told the World Health Organization, but they didn't tell their own people. And they threatened the doctor trying to sound the alarm. And so they created spreaders, which then took this plague all around the world.
That was a very important month. And governments in Europe and North America were denying. They were saying, nothing's the matter here. And so we lost a lot of time. When you have something like this, which is increasing exponentially, time is of the essence.
I would say what puzzled me a little bit about the response here is that we had so much time to prepare for this, and somehow we lost all that time. We knew this was coming in December, and tests were out in other countries in January. And for some reason, it took us another month or two to get this testing going. So basically the time that China gave us with all the measures, locking down their cities, we somehow lost that time.
But we have to recognize the problem and intercede early. That's the key lesson with epidemics.
What an epidemic does is, for example, it foregrounds collective dangers. The fact that now decisions are being made that have to take into account the collective calculus. It also focuses attention on the experts as representatives of the public, defenders of the public. In other situations, there's all sorts of worries about ulterior motives or their ties to pharmaceuticals, etc., etc. But the frame of epidemic changes. We're all rooting for them.
I just know, now, suddenly everyone, when I tell people I'm a virologist, everyone is like, oh, that's cool, right? Whereas before it's like, what are you doing? So I think the value of scientific knowledge is pretty high right now, which is kind of nice for our profession.
We're all rooting for them to be really what they claim to be, expert, professional, with integrity, etc., etc. So that changes the frame, and there is a chance.
Yeah, heroes and heroines of our time. Here are people who, in the face of something threatening, they push themselves into those stressful, anxiety-inducing, unsafe situations in a way that is courageous. I think that could be us at our best.
Yeah, you definitely see some of this. You see people, who are checking on each other. This is definitely a moment where we are all checking on each other.
I tend to see a lot of good that's going around. But of course, people that are typically anxious, I think this is increasing anxiety. This is anxious times for everybody.
Well, I'm a medical doctor, and what we know is that when somebody is under stress, they emphasize their underlying personality. And if their underlying personality is anxious, they will be more anxious. If they are stoical, if they are courageous, maybe they'll be more courageous. When you have a really bad event, things kind of polarize.
And he's exactly right. It does. But, part of the problem is that I see Twitter and things like this as exceptions anyways. We see those that are the outliers of all these personality types.
Some people decompensate and some people rise to the occasion. We've already had some heroic doctors in China who actually gave their lives fighting this outbreak.
I think the mental health of healthcare workers, this is going to be really rough because it's like super high pressure mixed with insecurity, mixed with fear for their own families.
Yeah, I think when things are really bad, you focus on, how can I protect myself? How can I protect my family? How can I protect the people I'm close to and I love?
Yeah, that's true. I see that with friends and family checking in,
And in many ways, it brings us back toward those fundamental connections, which are so important.
The script I wrote for that video of me and my dad, I was wondering how best to get the point through to young, healthy people that it's not just about you getting infected, it's about who you can infect. We used to enlist popular culture to educate the public, and we were very good at it. Science fiction is a great way of teaching us and exploring possibilities without tripping our ego defense mechanism. How do you deal with very thorny, scary subjects without scaring people away or without boring them to death? One of the great ways is science fiction. And we used to be very good at that as a nation. Show me an episode of Twilight Zone that didn't have a deeper message, or an episode of Star Trek, or most of the science fiction books written in the golden age in the 50s and 60s and even 70s. There was so much that we were trying to explore about ourselves, about the real world we were living in. But if you just give it a veneer of fiction, make up an enemy like zombies, or put it in space, then somehow we can talk about these real issues without being scared away.
And more importantly, I think it's a question of how we think about ourselves and whether we think about ourselves as kind of invulnerable, sovereign creatures in control of the situation, or whether we begin by thinking of ourselves as dependent.
Oh yeah, I think this is what we have to remember, particularly in this time of crisis. If we start to wonder whether Americans are up for the challenge, this is who we used to be. We used to be a country of very brave, very smart, very wise people who did what they had to do. This is what we did every day in World War II.
The greatest generation, quote unquote, is not great because they were any different than any other people. My personal feeling is that, people are roughly the same, but they found themselves in a situation that was different, that demanded collective sacrifices, and it was articulated in this way, and that was the frame: war. There is a war on a collective enemy, and that enemy is invisible, but it's not us, right? We have spent the last few decades polarized, where there was often a sense that the enemy was here. But now the enemy is not us. It's invisible, it can be inside us, etc., but it's not us.
I think everywhere in the world we're finding that our public health infrastructure is not adequate for an epidemic, and people have been neglecting our public health infrastructure for a long time, but the epidemic teaches us that epidemics do happen and you need to be prepared. It's like having a fire department. The fires only happen sometime, but you have to have that fire department working 24/7 so that when something bad happens, they're on top of it. And worldwide, our public health infrastructure, despite many people trying very hard, there hasn't been enough investment in it.
Here's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that we reverse the trend that we've been on for the last, 20 years, which is engineering a society based on comfort at the expense of resilience. Because that's where we're going now. That's where all the great minds and all the big money is going, is to making our lives more comfortable instead of also thinking about how we can be comfortable and safe. For me, the crowning moment was during the Iraq War, when Americans and Iraqis were dying by the thousands and the world was screaming for an alternative to petroleum. The world was addicted to this substance that was killing people. And what did we get? We got Steve Jobs crowing about this new device called the iPhone, where you could watch The Office. You could put television in your pocket. That was our solution. I saw it at the end of the last century, in the late 90s, when everybody was crowing about genetic cures. They were going to change everything. No more cancer. Boom, done. My mother died of cancer waiting for those genetic cures. What did we get at the end of the last century? What was the great medical breakthrough? Viagra. That was the great polio vaccine of the year 2000. A pill for baby boomers with erectile dysfunction. And so what I'm hoping is maybe this will be a wake-up call where we'll start to reverse that trend and say, listen, there's nothing wrong with a faster, brighter, more comfortable society. But let's make sure we build in a little insurance along the way.
Yeah, completely. I mean, it's not necessarily good for the ambition of a society to just be about comfort and pleasure. There are higher virtues than that. We've got used to the idea that we can isolate ourselves, right? And suddenly all of that has kind of melted away because there's a tiny, tiny little virus circulating, and it's somehow fundamentally reordering what we think of as important.
Yeah, only, as a sociologist, I think that once the frame changes, people change. Yeah, I mean, there's going to be some memory of this, but I mean, I think we are better served to think that the real memory that counts here will be at the level of government and experts, that they will learn from what happened and will build institutions and procedures and protocols to deal with something like this in the future. Ordinary people going about their everyday business, I don't think the likelihood is great. The frame of everyday life is not one in which you think about the public and collective issues, etc.
This will depend on what those lessons are in that long asymptote at the end of this epidemic. Did we learn the lessons where we failed? Did we act soon enough?
The thing that I would like indeed people to remember is the one that we started with, that we were all rooting for the experts. There's public health experts who are doing, really tough work on behalf of all of us and have to take decisions that are really not easy to take and that are easy to criticize. Because inevitably, given how expertise works, there are going to be mistakes.
I think generally, despite the fact that people are overly nervous and there's this sort of underlying anxiety that's sort of running through the community, there's still this sense of now's the time to come together.
But I think also generally, this like wasteful way of living that we have, if people can take this time to reflect, is this really where we want to go? It's one good aspect, that might come out of this.
So all we have to do is just adapt again. And we will. I think right now we have to find the rational middle ground in between denial and panic.
I think that's what's important, is that we're asleep and we kind of want to be asleep. And we've been asleep for a good long time, and this thing that's happening now is waking us up.